Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Um, I'm really excited to be here this morning. It's just difficult for me to show it at this hour, but I'll start sharing my screen and we'll just jump in. All right. Um, so I'm going to be sharing some work today that is from a chapter of my dissertation that I'm preparing for a paper. And so some of the pieces I think are related, and also because they're a section of the whole project, I'm still kind of thinking about how to tie some pieces together. So I apologize if some pieces seem disjointed, and I welcome your thoughts on where you see links and connections. So the project, a little bit of context around it. I was asking about how children learn and do emotional labor in mixed status Latinx families. For those of you who may not know mixed status, I'm referring to mixed legal status. Um, And so that means that in a family, you would have a minimum of one member who is undocumented in some way or does not have formalized legal citizenship, and a member who is. And so this can be a variety of a lot of different statuses, as there's a lot of statuses in the U.S. that are not really not any that are pathways, clear pathways to naturalization and citizenship. And so I'm going to share two findings and kind of like impartiality because I'll share a little bit more later, but it's the project is not just about children, it's also about how they do work in relationship to others because relationality is an innately like part of emotional labor, right? This kind of other-centered work. And so that's been an interesting part of doing this and figuring out kind of how do we understand the impact of children doing emotional labor? Um, and so the findings that I'll be focusing on today are about how children learn to do emotional labor by watching their mothers model particular things, including negotiation, exchange, and conflict management, and how children do emotional labor by participating in interpersonal spaces with their peers, primarily in family and community settings is where this took place, and a little bit in school settings. I always have to add a note that this is an interdisciplinary project, and so I utilize a few different forms of data collection, including observational data, interview data, and some interactive methods. The interactive methods are what I'm going to share a little bit more about later on because in working with children, my background is mostly in terms of work outside of the academy is as a domestic worker, nannying for children as young as like 4 weeks, 2 months old. And so I've had a lot of experience with early childhood. And so it was really fun for me to think about how to work with children ages 5 to 9 and think about like, how do I collect data in this setting in ways that feel, you know, accurate and just and fun, to be honest. So because it's an interdisciplinary project, I'm going to ground us in a little bit of the literature that I've drawn on. So I already referenced mixed status families. So the area of mixed status families, so a lot of the research that comes out of there and that I've drawn on is around legal studies and certainly systems of citizenship and how citizenship, regimes of citizenship are not necessarily equal for everybody, but are certainly impacted by individuals, gender, age, ability to work, and a lot of other things. Um, Family studies or family science has studied mixed status families just a little bit, but mostly because there's more increasing amounts of transnational and mixed status families. This tends to still frame them as immigrant families. And so there's hasn't been a ton of work kind of teasing out the details of what it really means to have this power differential exist within a family unit where we kind of presume everybody in this family unit is more or less the same, has more or less the same socioeconomic footing in society. And when you think about the different legal statuses of individuals and the power dynamics that can exist there, it's really just not the case. This is not the kind of family that is, I think, like represented necessarily in mixed status families. Um, then there's also this area of like children in studies. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's childhood studies, but studies that tend to include children, and not always necessarily as their children, but oftentimes as adults reflecting back on their previous childhood. And this area of work like was really important, but also, or is really important and was really important in my thinking. But it tends to focus on this like assimilation, integration, and really framing kids as like part of the future. Um, Childhood studies, I'm certain that you all know lots of this stuff, but certainly I think about like how children are agents and have situated and partial power. I think a lot about this recent turn as like a framing of childhood as emotionally priceless objects of investment, right? And what that means for their relationship to adults in their families and in their communities. And also because I'm thinking about emotional labor, and this is not an easily measurable kind of work, I started to draw on other areas of reproductive labor, including housework, caregiving, and working alongside families. And so then this pushed me into feminist and applied political economy. And so emotional labor generally has been studied as something that is done by adults for money. We know that it's gendered and invisible and that it's difficult to measure because it's not material and it's part of social reproduction. And so just gets easily hidden a lot. Um, but also, there's a huge trend in framing these skills as marketized social emotional skills. And so there's a lot of like, kind of like, I don't even know what to call it. Um, I think it's just really taken off in areas of like emotional intelligence, right? Like these kind of skills that we can hone and learn and continue to practice, but that increasingly those are the skills that will get you the promotion and get you to move forward. And so a continued framing around adults and how they do emotional labor, and in a very particular marketized way. So the framework that I use for this draws on three different areas. One is learning by observing and pitching in, developed by Barbara Rogoff and Rebecca Mejia Arauz. And this is really how I understand how I like see emotional labor as it's being learned. And so it's really about family-centered activities and how children learn by observing and pitching in. It's important to note that this is not a US based framework for learning. This comes from um, indigenous communities in Mexico and Guatemala, um, and really thinks about children in society in and learning in like a little bit different ways than we think about in the US, which is more like I will show you as the adult in the classroom and then you will do it and I will assess you. And Lopi is because it's focused on how children are part of an endeavor. It thinks a lot about how learning is an inherently intergenerational process. And so I found that it was a really useful way for understanding what I kind of had an inkling was happening in these families. I also think about emotional labor from Arlie Hochschild. And so I kind of pick it up to ask, how do we see it and measure? How do we understand when we're looking at emotional labor happening? And so I use her terms of surface acting, which I um, identify as um, like self-focused emotion work, and deep acting, which is social, and so kind of thinks about who else it's impacting. And then I make the argument that emotional labor is relational living, relational social emotional skills. And then I did kind of have to bridge it from Hochschild's theory into, well, what does that mean for children? If children are doing it, how do we understand it and how do we break that down? If it's not necessarily commodified, and if surface and deep acting, like when they look different, how do we know? And so I drew a lot on the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning is an organization that has developed the social emotional learning wheel, and it is an area that is really pushing this idea of there are certain sets of skills that are about self control, certain sets of skills that are about social skills, and then ultimately they push it as like it's important for responsible decision making, which I think can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but it is still a really useful tool for thinking about emotional labor and how to see it for children as they do it. And so we see that that happens a lot in like curriculum and through programming and family and friends. And so that was a big part of how I was able to understand how children learn to do emotional labor. So in this study, children learn to do emotional labor with their families, right? So as I mentioned, these are mixed status families. I worked primarily with mothers, not necessarily because that was my intention. I did come into this work thinking or wanting for it to be inclusive of other family members. And so in my data collection, I do have things from extended family members like grandmothers, aunts and uncles, um, kind of like temporary household members, because these families are also transnational. They oftentimes have family members living with them who are not full-time US residents. They kind of come on workers' visas for a season of the year, and then they go back to their nation, their home nation of origin, and have family there. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And even in those or even including this kind of expansive definition, right, of like family and who was permitted to participate, really only women were I think like ready to participate. And I think that's for a couple different things, but I don't really I don't really talk about it here. And so I mostly worked with mothers. Um, Nearly all of them were undocumented. A couple of them had temporary like workers permits. And so what I was able to see was that the ways that they did work in the community, like in more transactional ways, I guess, were some at some of these sites. And so I'll kind of touch on them really quickly. But so I was like at the public health seminar that this work took place also like kind of in the tail ends of the pandemic in the US. And so there was a lot of like public health work happening through this promotoras program in the community. And so mothers were part of that. They all kind of hung out at the parks. And that was an informal social setting. They all participated in this family initiative that was at the time embedded in schools, but then got subsumed into like a county-wide nonprofit agency. Um, and so I did work in the districts, although not necessarily in classrooms. But I also did some stuff, some observations at school sites, because there was a lot of family and community engagement efforts that happened at school sites. And also school sites were the site of food bank distribution. And so although I wasn't like in classrooms, I was at school sites quite often. And then the food bank distribution happened at sites, but also because mothers were doing work there for compensation. So like in all of these spaces, mothers might sign up for a shift or sign up to do a presentation or for the public health stuff because it's the promotoras model. If they attended a training and then got someone else, like, so this happened to me, somebody got me, you guys. But they were saying, hey, are you going to take your son to get the COVID vaccination? I said, yeah, I just haven't quite figured out where, because his doctor is like really, when it first came out, right, there was a huge wait to be vaccinated. And she says, you can just go to this clinic right here. So I said, all right, I'll give it a try. So I go over, and that's where my son gets vaccinated. The next time I see her, I told her, hey, I went to that clinic. It was really fast. Thanks for the recommendation. And she immediately turns to another mother and says, did you hear that? I got one. Because they get some sort of credit if you are able to say, this is how many people I referred, how many people like followed through with it. And so all of that is then quantified, and they get cut checks at the end of the month for their participation. And so food bank shifts, for example, it would be like Saturday morning and we're all like bagging rice, and all of these things sort of count towards the work that they do. And all of the mothers referenced the usefulness of this money. Sometimes it was cash aid, sometimes it was gift cards, but it was a big part of their involvement in the community. Oops, I'm jumping ahead. And a big part of their work. Wow, where am I going here? I'm not sure really. Sorry. There we go. Um, and also these mothers, also mentioned that they would only take work if it allowed them to keep up with their mothering responsibilities. I think this is a big part of how we see them doing emotional labor, because they are ultimately, I think, participating in a version of like intensive parenting and certainly intensive mothering. And so this is where we get to see Lobi happening for children in these spaces, because children are with them in most of these spaces. I would say maybe one of the areas that they're not as present in is the public health space, but even that, they're not very far. They're kind of just like outside the room playing with their friends. So all of these spaces are inherently family spaces. They're not child-centered and they're not adult-centered. And so we can really think about how their participation here is part of this intergenerational learning and shift the way that we think about where learning happens. Okay, so I'm really excited to share some of the methods, in particular for getting children's perspectives on how they saw emotional labor happening, also how they do it. And so these are just some images that I think I'll just kind of talk through a little bit of how we see this working. So I definitely did a lot of playing. So like this image at the top left of these baby dolls was in the middle of me playing with some girls. And it was just interesting to hear them talk about what needed to happen for a baby to live, like to care for a child, right? And it didn't just end in this play session, because I followed and traveled with these families to a lot of different spaces. For example, they would participate in this like once a month clothing swap, where you would bring your own bag basically, and you could come in and either take clothing, right, or bring clothing, right? So there's like a drop off section and a sort of loop to go through this big hall, if you will, in the community. And it was just tables and tables of organized clothing. And this is all volunteer based, right? So we're there together. And, I have a son who's little at the time. And so I'm like also looking through stuff in the newborn section. And one of the little girls is next to me and she says, this is perfect for my baby. And I said, oh yeah, which one? And she tells me the name, but I can't remember which baby doll that is. But then she tells me, yeah, because I just think that they're getting too big. They need some clothes, and we've got to think about them too. And so it's kind of a fun way for me at the time to think about how they consider what a mother might be doing to take care of their children, and the kind of mental load that it takes to care for someone else, right? And so similarly, there was a lot of really fun activities with pets in the home and seeing how children take care of pets. And so these birds, man, this is a saga. They're actually part of a love triangle. And there were babies born at the time of this data collection. And so there was a lot of focus on the birds and what they needed and their experiences. And so it was one of the main ways through pets to think about how children are kind of always thinking about someone else. And then there was a lot of community work and school work, so lots of cultural celebrations. And this image down here is from a TK and pre-K graduation. And so the families were asked to come in and volunteer. And it was just really, I'm doing it again. I cannot. Sorry, y'all, it's early still. Um, a TK and pre-K graduation. And they were all asked to come in early and set things up. And as some families came in early to do the setup, you could see that a lot of the children would bring in sort of treats for each other. And they were early, like they were instructed to hold on to them until the end, but they just couldn't help themselves. They were just like so excited to congratulate each other with their treats. And so there would be like bonbons on a stick, or like a little pouch in a fruit snack thing, with like a sticker, like "Congrats, grad," like stickers on them. And so they were all really excited to also like commemorate each other's triumph and success in this. And I think that was another fun example. Um, and then there was a lot of like household stuff. So in homes, in addition to playing sort of, what do you call it? Mm, like free form, like unrestricted, undirected, just kind of like free play. Um, I also brought some books in. And so these were books that were not necessarily social emotional learning books the way that we are seeing right now with a lot of like sort of like pop culture sort of stuff. Like I'm thinking about if anybody here knows Daniel Tiger. It's a spin-off from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Mr. Rogers, if you don't know who he is, was a really fundamental thinker in terms of childhood development and the television as it was developing. And so he was a producer and also the main character of his own show and did a lot of lobbying around education and media. And he was on the public broadcasting system, PBS, in the US. And so that has been a whole spinoff. And he really was foundational for a lot of the social emotional learning skills that we build on today. It's kind of remarkable how many people have roots in Mr. Rogers' approach to teaching in this sort of like uh, what's it called? Like the para relationship, right, through the screen. Um, and so it's not those books because those are really direct. I think at the time, it was mostly books that were just assuming that if we named feelings, that kids knew what to do with them. So in an interesting way, these books were certainly broaching on the subject of social emotional learning, but also falling short. And so I found that that was a really great opportunity to bring these books and then kind of push it to that limit and ask, okay, so you know the feelings, sad, right? And mad and worry or whatever it was. But then I would ask them, why does this image like, how do you know that? Because they weren't able to read, right? If I didn't read it to them, then they wouldn't necessarily know what it was. And just in case, I kind of covered it up, covered up that language on it. Um, and so I was asking them just like, how do you know this? And they would invariably bring me examples from real life. And so they would tell me, oh, when I see my mom mad, she's really upset. She doesn't want to talk to anybody. And I'd ask, why is she mad? And they might say, oh, because the house is dirty, because we've made a mess again, because my dad's about to come home, because there's all these pressures, right? And so they would give me these real world examples that started with just an image and just talking about where do you see this emotion come up? And they would kind of bring up their experiences encountering it with others and how they participated in it as well to kind of support that regulation or the excitement and share the joy, right? So that is a really fun part of this work. And I haven't figured out how to tease that out into its own thing or if it should be its own thing because it feels like I kind of have to talk about how mothers do that work. And so I just want to add that caveat. So children participate in an emotional landscape in two ways. So they do two kinds of labor. Um, and so they do this with peers, with their siblings and friends. And this has pretty direct impact because it's both self-management and interpersonal management, where they are counseling, listening, giving advice. And then with adults, where there is both direct and indirect impact. So through self-management, there is indirect impact, although I would argue that, in an adultist or like adult-centered world, everything that they do is going to have some direct impact on adults because of the ways that adults are managing situations to, right, like make things easier for them to kind of carry things through because they're deemed the ones responsible for these youth. And then there's also like interpersonal management, which I think is more direct impact. And that's where some of the stories from earlier that I was mentioning about where do you see this emotion and who has it and why, what's the context around it, and how do you participate in that or how do you respond? That's where there's really direct impact. And so I've got one example here that is for siblings and peers, how children do some emotional labor. And I picked these two sets of one that's for siblings and peers and one that's from adults, because this is the same child and her mother. And so Mariana, who was 9 years old and the eldest of three at the time, was talking about some of the challenges and what is that called? not collaborations, challenges, I guess, conflicts, that's the word, between her and her siblings. And so she mentions like sometimes he and Eric, her other brother, don't clean up their things. So I have to do it. And then I tell them, and sometimes then we fight. And so she's the eldest, and she is, I think, trying to step in, and I cannot with this setting. She's trying to step in and facilitate the sort of like family equilibrium on cleaning. But it's hard because she is 9 and her brothers don't necessarily see her as an authority. And so it's a little bit of a challenge. At the same time, Mariana's mother talks about how Eric, the youngest brother, who has has autism and is slightly impacted by it in terms of his like language development and certainly in terms of like more pragmatic skills. Um, it was kind of tricky for her at times. So Mariana's mother says, it's like he was so tired from listening to people to come home and to hear me, it was too much. And then it's always me telling him to do things or me trying to help him. And so when he's frustrated like that, he can't hear me anymore. But he would listen to Mariana, like it was a different perspective he was hearing. And she would sit with him and read, and he would calm down a little bit easier with her. And so, even though her brothers don't necessarily see her as a leader in the family, her mother does identify, Mariana plays a pretty critical role, in particular with Eric, the youngest, when he's feeling really dysregulated, that she's able to step in as, in some ways, leveraging her non-authority and her peer relationship, right, to help him to come back down. And so that's just one example of a really like robust, I would say, set of examples that are all sort of in the same pattern of for siblings and peers, and then the impact or the observation that adults see in it. And so I am really excited to hear your thoughts on it. But to conclude, I think what I'm trying to focus on for this paper is that care work happens across generations and is multi-directional, and that this evidence is that emotional labor is certainly everywhere, and that what it looks like actually depends on our positionality and how emotions are definitely more than a climate, right? There's some work that thinks about like an emotional climate that might exist in a space, but that instead, this is actually an emotional landscape because these individuals aren't just living in a climate. They're in some ways creating that climate because of their different power positionalities and the ways that they engage with each other in these relational spaces. And also that children use emotional labor certainly to be agents of their own lives and to contribute to their families and communities. So thank you all so much for hearing me. And I'll kick it back to Jessica.